The afternoon they fired me was the same afternoon I stopped being afraid of them. I want to be precise about that, because the order matters. It was not some inspiring shift that happened overnight. It was not a sudden burst of courage. It happened the moment Kyle Brennan slid a copy of my NDA across the conference table like a weapon, leaned back against his standing desk with that green wellness drink in his hand, and told me I had breached trust. I looked at the document. Then I reached into my folder and pulled out my copy. Not his version, mine. The one with the margin notes I had made years earlier. The one with the yellow highlights across the sections nobody ever read. The one with the clause I had quietly drafted, back when our general counsel still understood that people like me needed protection from people exactly like Kyle. Everything that happened after that moment was not revenge. It was just the contract doing what contracts are supposed to do. But to understand why one paragraph could bring down a man like Kyle Brennan, you need to understand what I had spent 16 years building inside TechFlow Solutions. And you need to understand what he spent 9 months trying to dismantle. People at TechFlow called me the contract architect. Most of them meant it respectfully. Some of them said it with the particular smells professionals use for jobs they find boring but necessary, the way someone might describe a building inspector or a compliance auditor. Accurate, polite, slightly dismissive. My official title was Senior Contracts Manager. What I actually did was stand between the company and the decisions it was too excited to think through. I was the man who read to the bottom of the page when everyone else had already moved on to celebrations. 16 years is a long time, long enough to watch 4 COOs come and go, each one arriving with confidence and departing with complications. Long enough to remember the vendor dispute in 2017 that nearly cost us our financial services license. A dispute that everyone in the current leadership team had conveniently forgotten, because it had been resolved quietly in the background by people like me. Long enough to understand that a single careless sentence inside a routine contract could cost more than an entire product launch. I was 53 years old. I had 2 kids in their second year of college. I had a mortgage that did not pause for corporate politics. I had 13 years until retirement, and I had built my entire professional life around one quiet truth. The most valuable thing a company can own is someone who prevents expensive mistakes before they happen. I was not loud. I did not perform in all-hands meetings or fight for visibility in glass conference rooms. I wore gray suits, drank too much burnt office coffee, and lived in fine print. My satisfaction came from finding the sentence, the one buried in clause 14 of a 30-page vendor agreement. That would have cost us millions if it had gone unnoticed. Give me a contract, a red pen, and one quiet afternoon. I could usually find what needed to be found. That was my value, not speed, not charisma, precision. Over 16 years, I had built systems that most people never noticed existed. Escalation protocols, indemnity language, compliance checkpoints, review trails that created accountability before a deal could go wrong. To the sales team, I was the man slowing down momentum. To product, I was the person asking the questions nobody wanted to answer. But when a clause created federal disclosure risk, when an NDA conflict threatened to poison a partnership, when one enthusiastic signature was about to open the door to a lawsuit, I was the wall between ambition and disaster. For 16 years, that was enough. Then Kyle arrived and decided the wall was the problem. Kyle Brennan walked into TechFlow in early spring with a Stanford MBA, 34 years of confident certainty, and a vocabulary built almost entirely around words like velocity, disruption, and momentum. The board adored him immediately. He was exactly the kind of leader they had been describing in quarterly meetings. Dynamic, decisive, unafraid to move fast. What they did not notice, because they were too busy being impressed, was that Kyle moved fast specifically because he disliked anything that slowed him down. And the things that slowed him down were generally the things designed to keep companies out of trouble. Within his first 2 weeks as COO, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. Legal started disappearing from email threads on active deals. Contracts began arriving with urgent approval flags attached to timelines that had been stretching for months, as if suddenly calling something urgent changed what was actually inside the document. In a meeting with the sales leadership team, Kyle laughed about the review process and said, "Legal will catch up. They always do." That was the moment I stopped seeing him as simply reckless. I started paying close attention, because men who find compliance amusing are not just impatient, they are dangerous in a specific, predictable way. They believe that the rules were written by people less capable than themselves, and that moving fast enough will outpace any consequence. Kyle began using phrases that were designed to shame people into silence. He would say, "Don't be the bottleneck," in meetings where the bottleneck was actually a legal review that existed for a reason. He called careful people legacy thinkers. He described documented risk as overcaution. He was not building a culture of speed. He was building a culture of compliance through social pressure. And within a few months, it was working. People who should have pushed back stopped pushing back. Lawyers who should have flagged concerns sent briefer emails or waited to be asked. Warnings that should have traveled up the chain got quietly buried in folders that nobody opened. Kyle had not changed the company's rules. He had changed the cost of following them. And I watched all of it from my office, with my red pen and my cold coffee and my 16 years of institutional memory. And I began doing the one thing Kyle could not stop me from doing. I started keeping records. The contract arrived on a Tuesday morning. It came with a cover note from Kyle's office describing it as a strategic partnership opportunity, a licensing deal with a Vancouver-based technology vendor. Revenue split, phased rollout, aggressive but achievable timeline. The kind of deal that reads well in a board summary and looks clean from 40,000 feet. By the time it reached my desk, Kyle had already pushed it through 3 internal stakeholder conversations, 2 calls with the vendor, and what he liked to call preliminary alignment. In plain language, that meant the deal was emotionally finalized before legal had touched a single page. My review was not a check. It was paperwork. I poured my coffee, sat down, and began reading. At page 1, it looked ordinary. Professionally drafted, competent boilerplate, nothing immediately alarming. That was usually the sign to read more carefully. The problems in contracts like this are never in the obvious places. They are tucked inside sections, buried between definitions and exhibits, dressed up in language so neutral it barely registers. I found it at page 14. A single clause, 3 sentences long, that quietly granted the new vendor access to aggregated partnership performance data as part of the integration requirements. Clean on its surface, standard in the abstract. Except the performance data in question was not generic company metrics. It was data specifically covered by a standing NDA with one of our largest financial services clients. Data that, under that existing agreement, could not be shared with any third party without written authorization. Data that, if shared through this vendor integration, would constitute a direct breach of that NDA and potentially trigger mandatory disclosure obligations under federal securities regulations tied to our financial client relationships. I read the clause 3 times. Then I set down my coffee and sat quietly for a moment. Because what I was looking at was not a drafting error. It was a contract that, if signed without correction, could expose 3 departments to regulatory investigation, create direct SEC disclosure risk tied to one of our most important client relationships, and hand a future plaintiff a paper trail showing that multiple internal employees had been informed of the conflict before the signature was obtained. This was not a business risk. This was federal court risk. I opened a new document and began writing. Clause by clause, conflict by conflict, prior agreement by prior agreement. I laid out every point of exposure in plain language, with no emotional framing, no accusations, no dramatic language about what might happen. Just facts organized clearly enough that anyone reading them would arrive at the same conclusion I had. This contract cannot be signed, not in its current form, not without revisions that address the NDA conflict, the data scope, and the disclosure exposure. 2 hours after I sent the memo through the correct internal channels, to legal, to compliance, to risk management, to Kyle's office, I received a calendar invite. The subject line said, "Review meeting, Brennan office, 2 p.m. I saved the invite, saved the memo, and noted the timestamp. Then I got ready. Kyle's office was a glass box on the executive floor. Everything about its design was intentional. The glass walls meant that anyone walking past could see exactly who was inside and read the general energy of the conversation from 20 meters away. There was no privacy, only the illusion of it. Kyle liked that. He liked accountability to be visible. He liked the social weight of a difficult meeting to be witnessed even when its content could not be heard. He did not offer me a seat. He was leaning against his standing desk when I walked in, holding his green drink, my memo open on his screen but positioned in a way that told me he had read it, the way a man reads something he has already decided to dismiss. Fast, irritated, looking for the line where he could start pushing back. He looked at me with the expression of a person who has mistaken impatience for authority. "You don't like the deal," he said. It was not a question. "The deal has 3 active conflicts with standing agreements," I said. "One of them creates potential federal disclosure exposure tied to our Meridian client relationship. This isn't about liking it. It's about what happens when we sign it as written." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they have stopped listening. "Warren," he said, "this is exactly what I'm talking about. You see obstacles where the rest of leadership sees opportunity. I see liability where the rest of leadership isn't reading past page 12. His expression shifted. Not anger, exactly. More like the look of a man recalibrating his approach because the direct method wasn't landing the way he expected. "Your role," he said, choosing each word with deliberate patience, "is to make the paperwork work. Not to override strategy, not to second-guess the COO. Your job is execution, not editorial." I looked at him. He was not misunderstanding the warning. He understood it perfectly. He was simply deciding that the cost of the warning was less uncomfortable than the cost of slowing down. "If you sign this contract as written," I said, "the paperwork will not work. That's the point." He straightened up, set the drink on his desk, and in the way that people reveal their real intentions when they believe they have already won, he smiled. "I think we've gotten the most we're going to get out of this conversation," he said. I picked up my folder. "Then I've done my job," I said. And I walked out. 3 days later, I came back to finish it. The meeting invite said contract alignment touchpoint. I had seen enough terminations in 16 years to recognize the language. Organizations wrap these moments in soft phrases, because clean typography makes the violence of the moment easier to process for everyone in the room except the person being processed. Main conference room, 10 a.m., the large one with floor-to-ceiling glass walls where the whole floor could watch without watching. When I walked in, Kyle was standing at the far end of the table, arms crossed. 3 department heads sat along one side, all of them developing a sudden, intense interest in the legal pads in front of them. Rachel Martinez from Legal Affairs sat near the center, a manila folder open in front of her, turning pages with hands that were not quite steady. Nobody offered me coffee. Kyle waited until I was inside the doorway. "We're terminating your employment," he said, effective immediately, "for breach of trust." The words landed clearly. I had been expecting them, or something close to them, since the conversation in Kyle's office. What I had not expected, what genuinely surprised me for a brief moment, was the specific language he had chosen. Breach of trust. Not performance concerns, not organizational restructuring, not a single word about disagreement over the vendor contract. Breach of trust. He was framing a compliance escalation as disloyalty. He was describing protected internal reporting as misconduct. And he was apparently counting on me to be too surprised or too afraid to notice the difference. "I escalated a documented compliance concern through the correct internal channels," I said, "to legal, to compliance, to risk management, all simultaneously. That is the defined escalation procedure." Kyle reached for the NDA on the conference table and slid it toward me with 2 fingers, like a man who had rehearsed this motion. "This agreement includes confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions," he said. "Any unauthorized external discussion of internal business matters could expose you to significant personal financial liability." He said it carefully, slowly, the way people speak when they want the threat to have time to settle. Rachel was looking at the folder. She had not looked up since I sat down. I noticed that. I pulled my copy of the NDA from my folder and placed it flat on the table between us. "Paragraph 12B, I said. Kyle frowned. He had not heard me ask a question or make an argument. He had heard me cite a clause number. Rachel's eyes moved to the document. Then they stopped. I slid it toward her slowly and tapped the highlighted section with 1 finger. "In the event of termination coinciding with a documented regulatory concern or protected compliance escalation," I said, reading from the text I had written myself years earlier, "the company agrees to assume full legal liability and defense costs related to said termination, in perpetuity, without cap." The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system. Kyle blinked. He still did not entirely understand what had happened. But Rachel did. I watched her face change in the slow, quiet way that faces change when someone receives information their body does not want to process. She looked from the clause to the termination notice she had signed off on. She looked from the termination notice to the date of my compliance memo. She looked from the date to Kyle. And I saw the precise moment she understood. This was not just a wrongful termination. This was a company that had fired a compliance officer 3 days after a protected escalation using an NDA that now obligated the company to cover every legal cost tied to that termination without ceiling, without expiration date, without any contractual escape. Kyle had not fired an inconvenient employee. He had triggered a legal mechanism with no off switch. I looked at him. "I didn't breach trust," I said. "I followed protocol. And now the company has breached indemnity." I closed my folder. Then I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the glass conference room the same way I had walked into it. Calmly, quietly, like a man who had just done his job. I did not storm out of the building. Dramatic exits are satisfying in the moment and useless afterward. Loud anger is easy to mischaracterize. Kyle needed me to look unstable. He needed me to say something that could be quoted, written up, and filed away. He needed a scene. So I gave him the one thing he had never been able to manufacture in all his months of startup bravado. Silence. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened my laptop. I had transition access under the termination agreement, standard procedure for senior employees with active project files. Kyle had not thought about that carefully either. I began pulling records. Not secrets. I want to be clear about that. I had no interest in taking anything I was not entitled to. I pulled my own documented work, the compliance history I had generated across 16 years, the escalation memos, the contract red lines with timestamps, the risk flagging emails, the vendor drafts with their modification logs, the threads where I had copied legal and compliance as required, and the threads where Kyle had quietly removed legal before pushing deals forward. Those were not in my records. They were in the company's internal system. But I had copies of the emails I had received, the warnings I had sent, the acknowledgments I had obtained. Enough to build a timeline. Enough to show a pattern. I organized them the way I had organized contracts my entire career, methodically, without emotion, by date and by category. By the time I closed the laptop and packed the last of my personal items into a box, I had not assembled a complaint. I had assembled an archive. And archives, unlike complaints, do not expire. By the time I reached home, my phone was already vibrating in my pocket. Former colleagues. People from legal who had been in the room and two who hadn't. Someone from product who had never messaged me about anything not deadline related. The texts all had that particular nervous energy of people who witnessed something they did not fully understand and need someone to explain it to them. What happened in the conference room? Rachel looked like she was going to be sick. Was it really breach of trust? I did not respond to any of them. Not because I was worried about what they might say, because I had nothing to explain to anyone. The situation was either going to resolve itself through the mechanisms I had already set in motion, or it was going to escalate into the mechanisms I was about to put in motion. Either way, no text message I sent would improve the outcome. I made coffee, changed my shoes, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the archive. I built it properly. One folder for the indemnity documentation, one for the ignored escalations, one for the flagged contracts with Kyle's approval signatures, one for the suspected disclosure issues, one for the Kyle timeline. A clean chronological record beginning from his first week, mapping every instance where legal had been removed from a deal process, every contract that had moved to final approval without completing the compliance review cycle, every email that showed a documented warning going unacknowledged. Then I cross-referenced the timeline against the vendor contract that had started all of this. The pattern became worse with every document I opened. Kyle had not made one reckless mistake. He had built a system, a systematic, deliberate process of bypassing the people whose jobs were to stop him from doing exactly what he had been doing. He used urgency as a tool. He used social pressure as a shortcut. He used words like bottleneck and legacy to shame experienced professionals into staying quiet. And the compliance function, the function I had spent 16 years building, had been slowly dismantled around me while I was still sitting inside it. What bothered me more than Kyle, if I am being honest, was Rachel. Rachel Martinez was not a bad lawyer. She was actually quite good in the years before Kyle arrived. But her initials were on documents where the risk assessment section was blank. Her name was in email threads where warnings had been received and not followed up. She had watched what was happening clearly enough to be pale in that conference room. She had just been too afraid to be the one to say it out loud. I thought about that for a long time that night. There is a particular kind of institutional cowardice that never looks like cowardice from the inside. It looks like pragmatism. It looks like picking your battles. It looks like understanding the culture and deciding which hills are worth defending. And by the time you realize you have been slowly moving away from every hill, You are standing somewhere you do not recognize, watching someone else pay the price for the silence you kept. I understood it. I had felt its pull myself years earlier, with a different executive making different demands. But I had made a different choice. And now I was about to find out whether that choice had been built on something solid. The cease and desist arrived by email the following morning. It came from a generic HR employee relations address, but every sentence inside it read like Kyle dictating to a paralegal. It was aggressive in ways that HR professionals are not. It was specific about things that HR professionals would not think to specify unless someone had briefed them carefully, and it carried a particular tone, the tone of a man who believes that threatening someone is the same thing as defeating them. The letter warned me against discussing internal company matters with outside parties. It invoked the confidentiality provisions of my NDA. It demanded that I preserve all company property and refrain from any communication that could be construed as disparaging or disclosing. I read it twice. Then I did something Kyle clearly had not expected. I created a new folder in the archive and labeled it Retaliation. Into it went the cease and desist, the termination notice, the meeting invite, the timestamp on my original compliance memo, the NDA with paragraph 12B highlighted, and every email showing that my warning had traveled through the proper channels before any of this began. Then I filed the cease and desist as Exhibit 1. Because what Kyle had done in his certainty that fear worked the same way on everyone was hand me a document that proved he was trying to silence me specifically after a protected compliance escalation. He had not sent a routine legal notice. He had sent a retaliation document stamped with a date and addressed to my home. Every time Kyle reached for a weapon, he was handing me another exhibit. I think about that now, and it still almost makes me laugh. But that was not the call I needed to make next. That morning, I picked up the phone and called Patricia Kane. Patricia Kane was an employment litigator in the kind of firm that corporate HR departments called extremely thorough in the particular tone of voice people use when they mean, "They will take us apart." I had met her during an unrelated matter years before, a case involving a senior executive who had believed that closed-door meetings left no records. Patricia had demonstrated otherwise quite efficiently. Since then, I had kept her number saved under a name no one at TechFlow would recognize. When she answered, I said only, "Patricia, it's Warren Pierce, it's time." A pause. Then, "Bring everything." The next morning, I sat across from her in a conference room that felt approximately as warm as a walk-in freezer. I laid the archive on the table between us. The flagged contract, the escalation memo with timestamps, the termination notice dated 3 days later, the NDA, paragraph 12B highlighted, the cease and desist dated the following morning, the Kyle timeline. Patricia did not interrupt. She read in silence for 15 minutes, her expression shifting in small, controlled ways. The expression of a lawyer who is watching a case become easier with every page. Then she held up one hand. "Stop," she said. I stopped. She tapped paragraph 12B with the cap of her pen. "Do you understand what you have here?" "I believe so." "No," she said. "You don't yet. You haven't just built a defense. You have built the kind of machine that makes the other side do the math before we even file. The clause is enforceable, it has no cap, and it was triggered the moment they handed you that termination notice." She looked at the timeline. "And then they sent you a cease and desist the next morning." "Yes." "Which they put in writing." "Yes." Patricia looked up. "They have given us a clean retaliation narrative with a paper trail they created themselves," she said. "We are not going to need to argue anything. We are going to present documents." She picked up the timeline and the NDA together. "I will send a letter to outside board counsel," she said. "Not HR, not Kyle's office, the board's outside attorneys. We give them one opportunity to assess this before we file. They will read paragraph 12B. They will read the timeline. They will calculate their exposure. And then we will see whether your board is uninformed or simply unafraid." She began making notes. "What do you want, Warren?" she asked without looking up. I thought about that for a moment. "I want the board to understand what Kyle has been doing," I said. "Not just to me. The vendor contract, the escalations he ignored, the compliance process he systematically dismantled. I want them to see the pattern." Patricia nodded. "Then we give them the pattern," she said, in the clearest language a board of directors has ever read. Patricia's letter went out that afternoon. It was addressed to TechFlow's outside board counsel, not to HR, not to Kyle's team, and not to the internal legal function that had allowed this to happen. This was a deliberate choice. HR exists to protect the company from employees. Outside board counsel exists to protect the board from exposure. We were not writing to the building. We were writing to the people who understood what unlimited liability meant for their own positions. The letter was 4 pages, controlled, factual, and structured with the kind of precision that makes senior attorneys sit up and read slowly. The first section quoted paragraph 12B in full, the indemnity trigger, the company's obligation to cover all legal defense costs and damages arising from the termination of a compliance function employee following a documented regulatory escalation, no ceiling, no expiration, no cap on what the company was now obligated to absorb if we proceeded to litigation. The second section laid out the timeline, my compliance memo dated Monday. Legal, compliance, and risk management all copied simultaneously, as required by protocol. The termination meeting 3 days later. The NDA threat delivered in the conference room. The cease and desist issued the following morning. 7 days from protected escalation to documented retaliation attempt. All of it time-stamped, all of it in writing. The third section was the strategic blade. TechFlow had 2 options. The company could resolve this matter privately and correct the retaliation before formal claims were filed. Or Patricia would proceed with formal legal action. Regulatory escalation tied to the unresolved SEC disclosure risk documented in my compliance memo, and a full discovery request that would require the company to produce every contract Kyle Brennan had approved without completing the compliance review cycle. She did not threaten. She did not perform anger. She simply explained the arithmetic. I sat across the desk from her as she hit send. She did not celebrate. She leaned back slightly and looked at me. "Now," she said, "we wait for the board to decide whether Kyle is worth the cost." I took a slow breath. "He isn't," I said. Patricia smiled. "They rarely are," she said. I made one more call before the board's lawyers finished reading. Greg Sullivan had been a regulatory auditor during a third-party review I had managed 5 years earlier. He was methodical, careful, and constitutionally allergic to situations where documentation had been handled badly. The kind of professional who could read a footnote and sense a problem 4 layers underneath it. He picked up on the third ring. I kept the call brief. "Greg, hypothetical. If a company's vendor agreement created disclosure exposure related to an SEC-covered client partnership, and internal warnings about that exposure were documented but ignored before the contract was signed, what would the reporting threshold be?" A pause. A long one. "That would depend heavily on specifics," he said carefully, "and on whether the warnings were legitimately ignored or simply not acted upon in time. The warnings were in writing, sent through correct channels, time-stamped, acknowledged by receipt. The contract moved forward anyway." Another pause. "Warren," he said slowly, "I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Do you have clean documentation? No accusations, no interpretive language, just dates, clauses, recipients, and what was done with the information." "I have a folder." He was quiet for a moment. "Send me something informal," he said. "I'll look at it and decide whether it warrants any kind of follow-up. I'm not making any commitments. I'm just saying send it." Within the hour, I had sent him a clean packet, the flagged contract language, my memo, the NDA conflict, the timeline, the termination notice, the cease and desist. No emotion, no editorial commentary, no adjectives. Just documents. Kyle had fired me to make a problem disappear. He did not understand that documented problems do not disappear. They travel. By all accounts, Kyle spent the week after my termination behaving like a man who had survived a minor inconvenience. He told the product leadership team that I had been reactive and difficult to align. He told sales I had been resistant to the operational model we're building. Someone who was in a strategy session later told me that he had described my departure as, and I want to quote this accurately, "a necessary correction to protect our forward momentum." Forward momentum. 16 years of institutional knowledge, compliance infrastructure, and legal protection gone for forward momentum. He genuinely believed it was over. Then Patricia's letter reached the board's outside counsel. And everything inside TechFlow went very quiet very fast. No angry phone call first, no heated demand for a meeting, no defensive email from Kyle's office threatening their own legal action. Just silence. The particular silence of lawyers who have read something they cannot unhear and are now spending careful, deliberate hours confirming that every word of it is accurate. They confirmed paragraph 12B existed and had been reviewed by prior outside counsel. They confirmed my compliance memo had traveled through the required channels before the termination. They confirmed the cease and desist had been issued the following morning. They confirmed that Kyle's email access logs showed he had received notification of the compliance escalation before the termination meeting was scheduled. That last detail was important. Kyle could not claim ignorance of my protected status. He had received the notification. He had seen the escalation. He had chosen to proceed anyway. The board did not yet know the full picture. Not the compliance infrastructure Kyle had systematically bypassed. Not the 14 contracts I had documented in the archive. Not the pattern of ignored risk assessments and missing legal sign-offs. They did not know about my call with Greg. They only knew what Patricia's letter contained. And that was already enough to make them afraid. By the end of the second day after the letter went out, Patricia received a brief message from outside counsel. It said, "We are reviewing the matter internally. We ask that you refrain from formal escalation while we conduct our assessment." Patricia read it to me over the phone. Then she translated it. "That," she said, "is corporate for. We believe you, we're terrified, and we are now trying to figure out how to remove the liability before it gets more expensive." I exhaled. "How long does the assessment take?" I asked. "Usually as long as it takes them to understand how much the alternative costs," she said. "In your case, with no cap on indemnity and a regulatory escalation already in motion, I would expect a phone call before the end of the week." She was right. It came in 4 days. The session the board called internally had no official name. But everyone inside TechFlow understood what it was. No investors, no product presentations, no quarterly language about growth and opportunity. Just 7 board members, the company's outside counsel on speaker, and a document in the center of the table titled Immediate Risk Exposure. Kyle was not invited. His badge had been quietly suspended from the 17th floor. From what someone told me later, he stood at the elevator tapping it repeatedly, as if the card was the malfunction, and not the investigation forming around him like water filling a room. Upstairs, outside counsel walked the board through the exposure in careful order. Paragraph 12B. Enforceable. Reviewed. Not buried by accident, drafted deliberately years earlier as a protection mechanism for compliance function employees. The termination triggered it. There was no argument available. The indemnity exposure. No ceiling, no time limit. Every dollar Warren Pierce spends on legal defense, every counterclaim, every damages finding, the company is contractually obligated to cover it all. Unlimited. The timeline. Protected escalation. 3 days. Termination, retaliation attempt, all documented, all time-stamped, all originating from within TechFlow's own email system. Then the regulatory dimension. The vendor contract that had started everything was still unsigned. Patricia had not needed to escalate to Greg's office yet, but the documentation existed. The disclosure risk was real. And if the board did not move to correct the situation, the next development would not be a private letter from Patricia Kane. It would be a formal inquiry from outside. A board member asked the question, "What is our total exposure?" Outside counsel answered without softening it. Unlimited on the indemnity. Significant on regulatory, depending on what the review finds. Reputational, if this becomes public. And ongoing because the underlying contract issue has not been resolved. The room went quiet. Not the shocked quiet of people learning something new. The calculating quiet of powerful people deciding what the most efficient exit from a disaster looks like. One of them finally said, "How did this happen without anyone stopping it?" Outside counsel looked at her notes. "Someone did try to stop it," she said. Nobody answered that. The meeting ended with a vote. Not on me, not yet. On Kyle. A cream envelope arrived at my house the following Tuesday, delivered by courier. It was from TechFlow's general counsel. Not Kyle's team, not HR, but general counsel, which told me something about who was now managing the situation. Inside was a letter describing what it called a generous severance and consulting arrangement, 3 months of salary, extended benefits, an agreement to drop all claims in exchange for a mutual release, a new confidentiality agreement, and what the letter called continued goodwill between the parties. They called it a gesture of good faith. I read it twice. Not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to appreciate the precision of the desperation packed into that language. Good faith. As if the dispute was a misunderstanding between equals, and not a situation where a company had fired a compliance manager 3 days after a protected escalation, sent him a cease and desist the next morning, and was now sitting across from an unlimited indemnity obligation and a regulatory inquiry it had generated itself. 3 months of salary. $12 million in exposure avoided, 16 years of contribution ignored, and they were offering 3 months. If you are still listening and you believe that silence, patience, and 16 years of quiet work deserve better than 3 months, subscribe to the channel. It helps more stories like this reach the people who recognize them. I sent the letter to Patricia. She read it, laughed once, and handed it back. "They still think this is a negotiation," she said. "It isn't. It's a reckoning, and they haven't finished adding up the number yet." We let the offer expire without a response. Not out of stubbornness, out of strategy. Because the board was still in the middle of its internal review, and I had not yet sent the full archive. The full settlement conference took place 6 weeks after my termination. By the time we walked into the room, the board had seen the archive. Not every document. Patricia had been selective about sequencing. dripping information in the order most likely to produce clarity rather than defensiveness. But enough. The 14 flagged contracts, the pattern of missing compliance sign-offs, the emails showing legal removed from deal threads, the escalations that had been acknowledged and quietly set aside. The Kyle timeline, documented from his first week to his last. Kyle himself was not there. His employment had been restructured the week before, which was the board's way of avoiding the word terminated while achieving the same outcome. The vendor contract had been pulled from consideration pending a full legal review. The compliance process he had spent 9 months dismantling was being rebuilt, reportedly under the supervision of an outside firm. TechFlow's outside counsel opened the settlement discussion with an offer significantly better than the first one. Full salary continuation for 2 years. Benefits. The company's formal acknowledgement of wrongful termination under the indemnity clause. Payment of my legal costs to date. And a letter placed in the company record, not published but filed, acknowledging that my compliance escalation had been warranted and that the termination was not related to performance. Patricia looked at me. I looked at the letter, acknowledging the escalation. That was the part that mattered to me. Not the money, though the money was fair. The acknowledgement. The formal, documented, company-signed statement that I had been right. That the contract was a risk. That the warning was legitimate. That the 16 years of precision work I had put into that building had meant something. We settled. I did not go back to TechFlow. Some people expected that the resolution would include some kind of reinstatement, some formal return to the desk where I had spent 16 years. But that was never what I wanted. You cannot rebuild trust with an institution by returning to it under the term it negotiated to avoid a lawsuit. That is not restoration. That is just a different version of the same problem. What I did instead was spend 6 months reviewing the archive I had built, not for litigation this time, but as a kind of professional inventory. 16 years of contracts. 16 years of flagged clauses and caught errors and quiet saves that nobody outside the legal function ever knew about. 16 years of the kind of work that exists specifically to be invisible when it succeeds. I began consulting. Other companies, smaller companies, mostly, without the resources for a full senior contracts function. Companies that needed someone who could look at a vendor agreement, find the sentence on page 14, and explain clearly what it was going to cost them if they signed without reading it. It turned out there were more companies like that than I had expected. And it turned out that people who have nearly lost something once tend to listen very carefully the second time around. I want to be honest about how I feel looking back on all of this. I am not triumphant. What happened at TechFlow was not a victory in any clean sense. A company I had spent 16 years inside nearly destroyed itself because one man decided that the systems built to protect it were inconvenient. An executive with genuine intelligence wasted it on shortcuts. A lawyer with genuine capability bent herself toward compliance rather than principle. A board that should have been paying closer attention was too busy being impressed. None of that feels like a win. What it feels like is a waste. What I do feel, the thing I hold on to is this, the clause held. Not because I wrote it well, though I did write it well, but because I believed, when I wrote it, that it would eventually be needed. I had watched enough good people get pushed out of organizations by people moving too fast to be careful. I had seen enough protected escalations go quietly unprotected. I had built the safeguard. Not for myself specifically, but for whoever was standing at that table next. That time, it happened to be me. And it worked. The last I heard about Kyle Brennan, he was working at a smaller firm in a mid-level strategy role. The kind of position that comes without a standing desk or a glass office or anyone to perform confidence for. I don't know the details and I don't need them. What I know is this. He moved through tech flow at speed, dismissed the things he thought were obstacles, and discovered too late that some obstacles are actually load-bearing walls. Take that out, and the ceiling follows. I spent 16 years understanding exactly which walls held the building up. Kyle spent 9 months learning what happens when you ignore the person who built them. If you found this story, and it stayed with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Would you have stayed quiet and built the archive? Or would you have confronted him in that first meeting? Have you ever been the person in the room who saw the problem clearly, but was told you were the problem? Leave your answer below. I read everyone. And if you believe that doing your job right, quietly, carefully, for years, deserves to be protected when the moment comes, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here for the people who know exactly what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who never bothered to read the fine print.